Their attendance, but it is still always good to meet with all of you. Good morning. So we'll bow our heads in prayer, and then we will begin. Dear Father in heaven, thank you for this day you have given us. Thank you, as Joy and I were talking about on the drive-in, that we have had a relatively cooler summer than we have in past years, and how it has just been such a refreshing and nice change of pace, and we thank you for it. We thank you for this Sunday. We thank you for your word, and I ask that this time is enlightening, but most importantly, honoring to you. In your Son's name we pray. Amen. All right, so the title of this lesson is A Bright Morning Light, and so this is going to be examining the passage in Proverbs, specifically chapter 4, verses 10 through 27. This will be relying a lot upon my own work in the classroom, and so it is going to be utilizing a translation that I had come up with, as well as kind of what I discovered and learned about this passage. And so our passage, beginning in verse 10, reads as follows. Listen, my son, and heed my words, that the years of life may be long for you. I have taught you in the way of wisdom. I have led you by the paths of the upright. Your footsteps will not be hampered in your travels, and if you run, you shall not stumble. Grab hold of discipline, never let it go. Protect her, for she is your life. You shall not go by the way of the wicked, nor shall you walk upon the path of evil men. Leave it be. Do not go on it. Turn away from it. Move along. For they will not sleep if they have not done evil, and they are robbed of sleep if they have not stumbled. For they eat the bread of wickedness and drink the wine of violence. But the path of the righteous is as a bright morning light, rising brighter and brighter until full day. The way of sinners is like impenetrable darkness. They do not know what they trip over. Listen to my words, my son. Keep them within your heart, for they are life to those who find them, and healing for all their flesh. Guard your heart more than anything, for from it springs forth life. Remove crooked speech from your mouth, and put devious talk far from you. Let your eyes be directly in front of you, and your gaze be straight before you. Ponder the path of your feet, and all your ways will be sure. Do not turn to the right or to the left. Turn your foot away from evil. All right. So, as always, in any good discussion of a biblical book, we do begin with the issue of authorship and the dating of Proverbs. Now, for those of you who might be familiar, what are some particular challenges with establishing authorship and dating of Proverbs? Okay, so it's a collection of works.
We have at least 3 authors that I think are named. Mm-hmm. And a couple different times when Solomon's material was collected.
Yes, so there are at least 2 collections that are attributed to Solomon. And again, we use the word attributed because there are questions of, are these sayings that he wrote down? Are these sayings that are attributed to him? Or are these sayings that as he learned from other courts that he gathered together and said, this is good wisdom? But there are others who are recorded as potential authors in the book of Proverbs, such as the Proverbs 31 woman. This is attributed to someone named Lemuel. And so this is not Solomonic. We are not sure who this person is, but that particular section in Proverbs is attributed to someone else. And so it is impossible to kind of establish an exact date for the book of Proverbs, that because it is a collection of sayings, that you have several larger collections, such as Proverbs 1 through 9, but then also through chapters 10 through 15, you have kind of these collections of like one-verse Proverbs. And so you have kind of multiplicity of potential sources that this is gathering from. And so the exact minimum, if you wanted to put a date on Proverbs, would be either the 10th century, which it has the era of Solomon and David in it, up to Hezekiah. At a minimum, for the length of composition of this book, and it is possibly that it is even older. And that is because it is a composite work that was done over centuries, and not all of the Proverbs that we have might not have originated within Israel itself. We know that the tradition of wisdom it was extensive throughout the ancient Near East, and it does say in the book of Kings that Solomon was a collector of wisdom, not always an author of wisdom. And so it is likely that some of these that the Israelites had collected over time did come from their neighbors. We also have to consider with issues of dating and authorship is that just because a proverb was written down doesn't mean that that's when the proverb was originally originated. That living in an oral culture, many of these proverbs might have arisen long before they were ever written down and were simply common phrases and common speech within their society. And so you have issues of, if you are able to establish when a proverb was written, is it possible that that proverb goes back even earlier? Another issue with dating proverbs is that they were intended to be time-transcendent wisdom. And so many of the details that scholars would use to establish when a proverb was written and what occasion was written for, those details are lacking because a lot of the information, especially the historical details that we might need, as well as the situations in life, are absent from Proverbs. And so this further complicates the issue of trying to have a specific time and place for which you read and understand the book. Now, the Proverbs that we are going to be dealing with are attributed to Solomon. But as anything, there are questions as to whether Solomon is the author. There are those who would say Solomon is not the author, and they would point to a tradition that they believe existed in the ancient Near East, where wisdom would be recorded, and then a book would be attributed to someone else in honor of them, even though the Proverbs and the writings of them themselves might not have originated with them. And so a lot of those who are skeptical of Solomon being the author of these would point to that tradition and say, this is established, we knew it occurred at that time, and there did not seem to be an issue with it. Why couldn't this have also been Solomon? Other scholars would point to the fact that there seem to be things that if this is Solomon's wisdom to Rehoboam, that they would say this doesn't sound like something that Solomon would necessarily want to impart to Rehoboam, such as the encouragement towards monogamy, which Solomon to the end of his life did not seem to value, or knowing how to deal with specific case laws and loaning of finances. There are some who would say these do not seem to be the kingly things that one king would be passing along to another. However, those who would argue against this and say Solomon is the author of this would point to the fact that it is not an established fact that pseudepigraphy, the act of attributing a work to someone else, is established in the ancient Near East. That they would say the evidence is dubious, and there is still quite a bit of skepticism, especially within scholars in Egyptian studies, as to whether that did occur within that era. And specifically, there are some scholars, one of which who I like quite a bit, named Kenneth A. Kitchen, who would say that the structure of Proverbs tends to follow a type of format that seemed fairly common during the era of Solomon. And so they would say, because this seems to be a structure, a way of writing Proverbs that dates to within the ballpark of the era of Solomon, then there is still plausibility that Solomon is the author. And so there is no need to dispute this. Other issues with establishing author has to deal with, are we attributing the authorship to be the person who wrote down the proverb or the person who first spoke it? That the concept of using a scribe, and depending on the era, scribes were often given a certain amount of latitude to amend or correct or refine a saying. Might indicate that someone else's hand is in the work. But again, there's not a lot of evidence to go off of with Proverbs in this. This is merely going off of this was a common practice at the time, and so it is something that has to be considered. Now, my view on this issue is that, especially without concrete evidence or a consensus, I believe that the simplest solution is that Solomon is the likely author. That I do not think that there is enough weight against his authorship to say that he did not either originate or collect these works. And there is biblical tradition elsewhere, specifically in 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles, where he is a speaker of wisdom. And so we know that from an oral perspective, he is the originator of certain wisdom sayings, but that he also collected a lot of wisdom sayings from the cultures around him, and saw that what they had learned was genuine revelation. These were true and wise things, and they were things that the Israelites and his son Rehoboam needed to know. And so I do believe that, in light of any established facts against Solomonic authorship, the simplest thing to go is what the text attributes to him. Now, the literary form of Proverbs 10 is Proverbs 4, 10 through 27, is not Proverbs. And here's what I mean by that. A proverb is a short, pithy saying that communicates general truth. But if you look at this passage, it is not a short, pithy saying. And in fact, it is quite lengthy and is a part of a larger dialogue. And so what we have in the book of Proverbs are two different types of literary genres. There are Proverbs proper, which you will find as minor sayings, specifically in the middle of the book, but then you also have what's called poetic discourse. And these are kind of longer sayings by one particular speaker or another, such as in the case of Solomon, where all of chapter 1 through chapter 4, and then beyond into chapter 9, are a part of a larger set of discourses. And so many of these are read in light of one another, but here today we're going to be focusing specifically on the smaller unit. And finally, because this is poetry, was part of common Israelite practice where they practiced a form of parallelism. Now, the type of parallelism that we might be familiar to is word rhyming, same meters, the same amount of, either a varying amount of syllables between one line or another. Hebrew poetry, specifically in its original language, does often follow a same type of meter in that they are trying to keep to a similar number of consonants, not consonants, words between lines. This is lost in English, but more specifically, they focus on what is oftentimes termed as thought parallelism, where they are not so much trying to rhyme the words, but they are trying to, in a way, rhyme the ideas that are found in it. So specifically, we have some types. I've decided to pick kind of the most common types that show out within the book of Proverbs here, is that you have types of parallelism called synonymous, where this is frequently employed to highlight the father's specific exhortations. Now, synonymous means that to the largest extent, all parts of the verse are repeated in some way in the following verse. So such as verse 11, I have taught you in the way of wisdom. So that would be line A. Line B of verse 11, I have led you by the paths of upright. You have the same subject, you have the same object, and then you have the same idea that is trying to be conveyed to them. That you have the speaker, I, teaching or leading you in the way of wisdom and the paths of upright. And so this is an example of synonymous parallelism. Another example is found in verse 14. You can also get this in negative commands. You shall not go by the way of the wicked, nor shall you walk upon the path of evil men. So you have a negative exhortation with the imperative towards someone, with a negative command that you are not to walk, you are not to go upon this particular path. And wicked and evil men are in parallel to one another. They are meant to be kind of regarded as the same thing. You also have a type of parallelism called complementary parallelism. Where this is often used to highlight the benefits of wisdom and the harmful nature of wicked living. Now, complementary, it can be rather broad, and that it is that not that the ideas are the same, but that it in some way complements or advances the idea of the previous line. So, such as verses 16 and 17. For they will not sleep if they have not done evil, and they are robbed of sleep if they have not stumbled. For they eat the bread of wickedness and drink the wine of violence. And so there, you do have two types of parallelism. You have synonymous again, because the wicked are unable to sleep unless they have done evil. But then it is complemented by the reason, because they eat the bread of wickedness and drink the wine of violence. And that's why they cannot sleep until they've done evil. So you have two lines of synonymous parallelism, but then both of those units complement one another. And so you do have, in several cases, layered parallelism, where you have several lines that follow one type of parallelism, and then a later line will in some way relate back to it. So again, in verse 14, you shall not go by the way of the wicked, nor shall you walk upon the path of evil men. This is synonymous parallelism. But then you have a seemingly unrelated line. Leave it be, do not go on it, turn away from it, move along. Just a series of imperative commands. But then you get to verse 16, and then you are given a reason for it. So it is meant to be read in light of verses 14 and 15. And so why he is to not go along the path of the wicked is because those who are wicked will not sleep unless they have done evil, with the idea being that if he goes upon this path, that if he takes part in their lifestyle, then the son will eventually be one who cannot sleep until he has done evil. And so all of Proverbs 4, 10 through 27, you can kind of divide it up into 6 exhortations with the accompanying reasons why the son is or is not supposed to follow the exhortation. And so here we will do a little bit of crowd interaction as we go into it. So our first discourse begins in verse 10. Listen, my son, and heed my words. Now what are either the reasons or the benefits given for that particular exhortation? In verse 10.
The years of your life will be many.
Okay, now what does that mean? The years of your life will be many.
You're going to live long.
Okay. So there is an idea that following wisdom, that living by wisdom, can have an impact on how long you will live.
Well, it also echoes the 5th commandment. So,
Mm-hmm. How so?
well, it's the only commandment that comes with a promise, like honor your father and mother, that your days may be long upon the earth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good. I hadn't made that connection.
Yeah, it's tapping into a broader tradition.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very good. So, again, tapping into the broader tradition that a lot of times wisdom is regarded as something separate from the law of God and the law of Moses. But the phrase that you hear a lot in Proverbs, that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, that if you were to look at all the times that phrase comes up and what it means, is ultimately follow God and obey his commandments. So to follow God and obey the Mosaic covenant is the beginning of wisdom, according to Proverbs. And so there is a close connection in the ideas of what is in the Mosaic covenant and what is in Proverbs. But what Proverbs deals with specifically is how to get around life in general. Because the Mosaic case laws, as we see with issues later on in Judaism, specifically in Jesus' time, they're not comprehensive. They don't address every little particular situation that you will deal with in life. That you are going to come to things where you're like, I don't know how the law of God applies here. I don't know, how to tell the difference between good and better. I don't know if this is a wise thing to do. And so wisdom comes along and tries to teach people how to navigate the gray areas that the law of God does not directly speak to. Because they believed that, even though the law of God did not specifically address everything that they would ever encounter in life, God had designed the world in such a way that they, if they could learn by wisdom how one could live well in this world, they would be obeying God. Our second discourse, or our second exhortation, to grab hold of discipline in verse 13. What is the reason or the benefit for grabbing hold of discipline? Or some translations might say to keep hold of instruction.
End of 13, it says it's your life.
Okay.
Kind of similar to the whole idea of a long life.
Yeah, that to lay hold of discipline is that it is your very life. It is tied to your very being and how you will exist and what type of life you will experience in this life. The third exhortation, you shall not go by the way of the wicked. And again, we had spoken on this a little bit briefly. Why does he not want the son to go by the way of the wicked?
You'll go their way. You'll follow them, and they'll introduce you to all kinds of perverse ideas.
Yeah. Okay. And that's rather common, with following in the path, following away, that it means that you are living in their lifestyle, you are keeping their company. But again, thinking back to a couple slides earlier, he gave a reason. You can, it uses for or because.
16 and 17.
Okay, 16 and 17.
Basically, he says it basically leads such an appetite for evil that you can't even rest until you've done it.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
I had one question.
Okay.
At the end of 16, I believe in your translation, you said there, obviously, unless they stumble. Yeah. I noticed in mine, it says, unless they cause someone to stumble or make someone stumble. So I did a quick look at one of my reference books, and it does say that particular Hebrew form does mean to cause to, rather than to stumble yourself. It is actually to cause others to stumble or cause harm to others. I just wondered if there was a reason you had gone the other way.
All right. I don't have it written here, so I'm trying to remember what I had done in my paper. It's that with the causation, if I remember right, there's a question as to who is the object of the causation. Is it themselves, that they are causing themselves to stumble, or is it that they are causing others to stumble? If I remember, and I chose to focus specifically on they being the ones causing themselves to stumble, so that it is self-defeating, if I recall how I had.
I guess the thing I would say is that it would be more of a true parallel. If you look at the first phrase, they cause harm, and here it would say cause to stumble, and that would be the same idea.
It would?
Yeah, and that, I checked a couple of other translations, and they all go that direction. So that's why I just wondered if there was a specific reason.
I would need to go back to my
Okay.
paper to see
Thanks.
what I wrote down.
And it could be
On that.
both, because in NIV it says, for they cannot sleep till they do evil. They are robbed of slumber till they make someone fall. So they do evil and then make someone fall.
Yeah, but that's the stumble in the second phrase then.
Right.
Yeah. And so, a lot of times when you're going with translations, especially in poetry, decisions that you make in one line ultimately impact decision you make in another. And so I had chosen what line A was supposed to be, so I made line B follow accordingly. But to go back to what Craig was speaking about earlier, is that the reason why the Father in this context is saying don't go along the path of the evil is not necessarily that he will keep company with them. It's that becomes this all-consuming lifestyle.
He doesn't just, he's not around it. It becomes him.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that it's in some way, and that in some ways it keeps him from finding any sort of peace, choosing to behave himself at night, where I'm sure we will experience it with Matthias, where I do remember it slightly as a kid, where you get something in your brain and you can't get it out until you do it, even though you know it's wrong. I remember that as a kid, where just you got something in it and you're like, I'm going to go do this. I know I'm not supposed to do it, but I'm going to do it anyways because I can't stop thinking about it. And then you go and do it and you're like, that was such like a terrible thing. I got in so much trouble. And yet you felt like you couldn't stop yourself from going on doing it. And this is the same thing that this lifestyle of the wicked, this path of the wicked, will ultimately be for the Son, is that it is all-consuming. The fourth exhortation, in verse 20, listen to my words, my son, or in the ESV, my son, be attentive to my words. And so what is the reason or the benefit for this exhortation? Again, it's a lot of, do this because of this in this passage. And so if it sounds repetitious, it's because it is repetitious. So, my son, be attentive to my words, incline your ear to my sayings, let them not escape from your sight, keep them within your hearts. Craig?
I was just going to say, just reading down through verse 25, 26, it's interesting to see, he says, hold on to these words, and then he just starts talking about guarding them with your heart, and he says, they bring life, they heal the body, they're a source of life, they protect your mouth, your lips, verse 24. So it's almost like he's talking about practical outworkings, even in what you see, how you speak, all these kinds of things by listening to these words.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and this, that anticipates a later slide that talks about some of the literary imagery that he uses here. And so by holding on to this wisdom, by keeping it to it, by listening to it, he's saying it is not just empty words, that it is life, it is healing for you. Because if you keep this within your heart, and this idea is to be protective, to be vigilant, of your heart against these wicked influences, because from the heart, from the very being, and again, in Hebrew, and I've spoken on this a little bit before, but it always bears repeating, that the heart in Hebrew thought is not simply the center of emotions. It is not this beating organ. It is the center of who they are as a person. It is where volitional choices are made. It is where their thoughts are. So it is the place of critical thinking. And so what we would always say, you must love God with your mind and with your heart, that for them, it would simply say, love the Lord your God with your heart and your heart. Because you are to love him with your emotions, with your choices, with your critical thinking capacity, the very center of who you are. And so this place, this inner life, is what flows forth springs of life. Now, why would they use the imagery of a spring? Again, this is the water source, not the season. Is Israel a very wet climate, or is Israel a very dry climate? For those who've been there.
Source of life, right?
Yes, it is a source of life. But again, the imagery of why a spring of water, why would he use this?
It's like a gift.
Okay. It is like a gift.
It's also something that you don't necessarily see the source of a spring. It flows out because it's just, apparently I'm wrong.
Yes.
It flows out because it's just inherent in nature.
Yes. That the idea that it's springing forth is this Hebrew idea that it's bubbling, it's gushing out. It is not something contained, in a sealed crock pot or some sort of steamer, that it is gushing out. It cannot help but overflow and move out. And they use this imagery of the spring as a positive imagery because Israel is a fairly dry climate. There are not many freshwater sources that they get other than springs, other than the few rivers that they have, and rain from the sky. They are very much dependent upon water sources coming from without. And so finding this underground spring that is now gushing forth life-giving water, fresh water, is something that, for them would have been like, this is life itself.
And it is the purest and most reliable source of water that they had. They had cisterns,
Yes.
which basically water could get stale.
Yeah.
They had rivers which were dependent in even the Jordan, they're almost in every case upon rainfall, and you had a lot of seasonal rivers,
Yep.
but a spring
An underground source of water.
is giving you water from a place you don't recognize, but it is consistent, it keeps coming, it's the freshest. There's a bit of a mystery to it.
Yes.
as well.
Yeah, and so this is what the heart is, and this is why he is to guard and protect his heart, because whatever's in there is going to come out in how he lives, whether that is in wisdom or whether that is in wickedness. And as I said, again, already anticipating it because it was connected to it, to guard your heart more than anything, because from it your life shows and is evidence. And then finally, in verse 24, to ponder the path of your feet. And again, it's very simple. Why do you look where you're going?
I have a nice bruise on my toe to tell you.
Yeah, it's because you don't trip, you don't stumble. You both are aware of where you're going, but also you are looking intently at the road so that you do not stumble. And so he's using, again, very, very common, these are not complicated ideas. He's just like, look where you're going in both a very real and figurative sense. He says, pay attention to how you're living.
I think it's actually verse 26.
Verse 26? You were right. That is a typo. That is supposed to be verse 26. My mistake. And so, with all of these is, you notice that early on, Solomon doesn't use what we would consider common reasons for don't follow the path of the wicked. Normally it's, because the wicked are going to get what's coming to them, or there is some negative outcome to living wickedly. He doesn't really do that in this passage. He is focused entirely on what someone's life and habitual pattern is like. And so in his warning of a wicked style is, don't go down this, because it becomes an addictive lifestyle. And it's not just addictive to some sort of substance, it's addicted to malicious behavior. To one where the person cannot imagine and go about life not living that way. Whereas the one who lives wisely, they can see where they're going. That wisdom gives them life. And so for him, the ultimate benefit of wisdom, if kept in the mind and the heart, is that it is healing to yourself, but it is also life-giving. So some literary devices that we often see in this, and again, a lot of these, they're very simple, but they are meant to kind of draw out the repetitious image that you have in the book of Proverbs. And so there's the sequence of orach and derech in Hebrew. And every single time that it is used, and it is only twice, orach is used of the righteous path, and derech is used of the wicked path. Now, both of these words have no moral connotations to them outside of this context. They are two different ways of describing the same thing. You know, it's the same thing as like, oh, take the road or take the highway. It's that banal of these two words. And yet, the author here uses these as visual signals to clue the in this person, oh, you want to go upon the righteous path, and he gives it its own unique word, and he uses its own unique vocabulary. But you want to avoid the wicked path, and he gives it its own unique vocabulary. And again, these are all meant to be just visual clues to the listener and to the hearer so that they understand this way is righteous, this way is wicked. We also have a lot of metaphorical parts and actions referencing the body, that you are to walk in a certain manner. And this is a phrase that originated in the Bible. It is still fairly common in English today that when we talk about, pay attention to your walk, and this is probably now something a little more restrictive to Christian subculture. What do we mean by pay attention to your walk?
Your walk is your life, so you're paying attention to the way you conduct yourself.
Yeah. Pay attention to how you conduct yourself, how you act, what you say, what you do, where you go. And again, very, very simple. Then also, the son, he is to listen to the father's words. So we have another part of the body being referenced. So he is to conduct himself in a certain manner. He is to listen to the father's words, because if he doesn't listen, then he's not going to know. He is to then protect his heart / mind. So we have another part of the body reference. He is to refrain from wicked speech. So he is not to speak wickedly. He is to speak righteously. He is also to look where he is going. So he is to use his eyes to see where he is going. Finally, he is to think critically about the path in life that he is walking. And so, in summation, all of these things by themselves, they're very simple and easy to understand. But again, what in summation is he trying to drive at by using all of them together in the same passage? Was my question too confusing, Joy? All right, I'm sorry. So, what might the author be trying to communicate by referencing all these different parts or actions of the body?
The all-encompassing effect of wisdom.
Yes.
It's not. You can't just treat it as a subject to be studied.
Mm-hmm.
You can't just treat it, in one particular way or apply it to one aspect of living.
Mm-hmm. That is true. Yeah, and that's often what I've seen others, focus on, that it engages the whole body, the whole mind in wisdom. It is not simply knowledge to be gained. It is not blinds, to use and make fun of a phrase that I remember hearing, back in high school youth group, being on fire for Jesus, without actually knowing, well, what does Jesus actually say and want us to do? And a lot of times I would see that contrasted with someone who was on fire for Jesus didn't know their Bible very well. But in contrast, we would have people who knew their Bibles really well, and yet they did not live as if they understood it. And so I had often heard it taught that, yes, it is good to be on fire for Jesus, but you need to know what it is that Jesus calls us to do. You need to also be on fire for his word and to learn it, as well as to live it. Very, very difficult concepts for high schoolers to grasp. I recognize our brains are not fully developed at that time.
Well, yeah, and
Go ahead.
kind of a little bit of a, I don't know if it's a rabbit trail or not, but just in thinking about wisdom and how to live. I remember, it's what, been 15 years ago now, maybe more, that David Platt's book came out, Radical.
Oh, yeah.
And basically his whole thing is you need to wake up, you need to not just settle for the status quo. And I mean, basically, a very passionate vision for living, just living out there, on the edge, applying God's word, just, get on a plane and go someplace and be a missionary. All these kinds of things. And I appreciate a lot of what he said. But I also know that many of the things he talked about were beyond the ability of many Christians just living their lives, working, supporting their families, to do. And there were a couple of others, like Michael Horton, who responded with his book, Ordinary. And basically, his whole thing was, it's fine to be passionate about the truth and passionate in your application and your pursuit of truth. But sometimes that's going to look very ordinary. It's not going to be, you're the person who is leading a charge to some country, and doing something grand. You're doing something very much ordinary in the day-to-day life, but you are doing so faithfully, and you're doing so in trying to apply the word.
Yeah.
So it is kind of echoing this idea that we've got to apply it, we've got to know it, we've got to apply it across the board, and not just, as I think sometimes happens with some people who tend toward the more radical end.
Yes, because
let our emotions just drive us to do something out there.
Yeah, it sounds good, and honestly, it seems to be in keeping with what we see the disciples and the apostles doing. But if you read between the lines, especially in Paul's letters, all of his advice, the scope of the New Testament is to people who aren't going anywhere. People who are trying to survive in the Roman Empire.
Living as committed Christians in Corinth and in Ephesus. And,
Yes.
Yeah.
Living ordinary, boring, sometimes very repetitive, very mundane lives. And that's who the Word of God was to. And it wasn't calling them to all be like Paul, or all be like Peter, or all be missionaries. I mean, if everyone's a missionary, who's funding the missionaries? And so a lot of what we see in this advice doesn't take into account the larger scope of essentially the wisdom of how things function. And so we do need to consider, faithfully, am I called to this? Or am I just called to be, for some of us, a good father, and a good employee, a good husband, a good friend, a good neighbor, and that's it.
And that's what the wisdom of Proverbs allows you to do in a way that is glorifying to God and also just personally beneficial.
Yes. That Luther, though it is considered apocryphal, so it is likely not said by him, but it's still a great attribution that during the medieval era, to be a monk, to fully radically commit oneself to God in the monastery was considered the highest calling and the most God-honoring thing that you could do. And the rest of us just kind of had to deal with the fact that God was like, you're not, you're just so because you're not a monk. And so Luther, in challenging this idea, does begin the first kind of reformation of theology of vocation, of living honorably doing what you do. And so this saying distributes them that how does the cobbler, honor God? By making good shoes. That is how he honors God, that he does quality work, that he does his work well, he does it honestly and honorably, and that's how he honors God with his vocation. He doesn't have to go out and become a monk.
And yet, he also then speaks, and I love this, one of the things I love to read of Luther's is his letter to his barber. His little booklet to his barber, who had asked him a theological question while he was shaving him. And it's a beautiful treatise about living the Christian life within your vocation.
That's great. I haven't heard of that one. That one sounds good. And so the theology of Proverbs, and specifically of Proverbs 4, 10 through 27, as you've read it, it's super simple. Like, again, there was a point when I was writing this paper and going like, this doesn't sound very erudite, this doesn't sound very profound, and ultimately having to be okay with it because it's not. It's a very simple passage. And it's a very simple message. And so its theology is, simple and repetitive. That in this, we must be okay, and we are having to fill in some details. We are having to exercise a bit of wisdom and critical thinking because theology of the passage lacks concrete expressions of what it means to be faithful. It just says, guard your heart. Well, how? I don't know, you're going to have to figure it out in your own life and in your own context, what that looks like. Because he doesn't give you a concrete expression of it or an example of it. There is no character to point to learn your lesson. It's, you've got to figure it out. And that's going to look different for each person and for each situation. But he also lacks concrete sense, and he also doesn't give the rationale for why the wicked choose to do what they do, other than the fact that they're addicted to it. So he's not trying to give us, this long philosophical treatise of how to think your way out of this. These very simple commands. It's like, don't do this. You should be wise enough, and you should understand by looking at these other things and these other things you're learning to recognize what the path of wickedness and what the path of righteousness is. I find that this passage, to me, seems to have a parallel in the New Testament, and specifically the Sermon on the Plain with Jesus in the Gospel of Luke. Or in Luke chapter 6, verse 45, he writes, "A good person produces good out of the good stored up in his heart. An evil person produces evil out of the evil stored up in his heart. For one's mouth speaks from the overflow of the heart." Going back to verse 23. "Guard your heart more than anything, for from it springs forth life." That what we have in us, what we habitually do, ultimately comes back and starts to fill up these storehouses we have. Now again, there are some very black and white imagery where Jesus says a good tree cannot produce bad fruit and a bad tree cannot produce good fruit. And then we're going, well, God, why am I producing apples and pears and figs? The fruit does not seem to be fairly consistent. And so we do have to recognize that occasionally there is very hyperbolic language, but the ultimate idea is that as one lives and as one does, that has ramifications later in life. And again, we know this. A baseball player, for Texas Rangers is the shirt that I'm wearing, is only good at baseball because he habitually plays baseball. He does not introduce cricket or soccer into his practice, into his gameplay. And that's why he's good, because they practice. And so with our application for today is we do need to pay attention to the life that we lead. And some of this, might just be examining a single area in our lives. I do think sometimes we are often a little too hard on ourselves. Again, going back to the, I must, live radically. It must be these giant expressions of faith, where it might just be, maybe my attitude when I deal with something in life, maybe I need to be more cautious about how I let my thoughts go. And so, like, for those of us, who have or have had jobs that are difficult, the thoughts that we allow to enter into our heads, and especially as we allow them to kind of seep and stew, that does, in some ways, make mountains out of molehills. It can make things worse than they actually are. Or at the very least, it can make our ability to handle them honorably a lot more difficult. We also learn from this that one must actively steer away from wickedness. So it is not just don't listen to him, it's don't go near this. Don't go along this path. Don't even start. Because this is ultimately where it goes. Now again, we must think wisely that Jesus does not call us to never associate with the wicked or to never associate with people who are not Christians. We have to. It's part of life. You meet them on the road. The only way to do that is to go out into space and be by yourself, to be completely isolated, like a monk. And so when we think of how do I live the Great Commission, how do I preach the gospel faithfully or share the gospel faithfully, how do I do that and yet not go down the path of wickedness? That is something that each of us must then consider wisely, because some of us are more prone to the influence of others. Some of us are not. Some of us are really good at influencing other people and have a lot stronger personalities. I know I don't have a strong enough personality to influence a crowd if I'm outnumbered. And so I have to think more wisely. How do I influence and keep the gospel and yet not go down the path of wickedness? We also learn that wisdom must be mulled over and practiced and not simply heard. We hear in the law of Moses that the law of your Lord your God is supposed to be upon your heart and upon your mind, that you are to murmur, you're to be thinking about it always. And so it is not something where it's heard and one and done, but might need to be considered. I wonder how this might play into my life. Now, if we don't have an answer right then and there, it might be that we have not encountered a part of life where we need to apply that. And so we should store that away and not beat ourselves up over the head until we find the right application of it. But we are to consider it. And so we do learn that our habitual patterns, just as people, psychologically, we're designed by God to nurture and develop our inner life. And so we cannot live in God's wisdom if it is not practiced and if it is not mulled over. We do learn, and I think this is the most fascinating in this passage, that wise living becomes cyclical. That the more wise you become, the more you listen to wisdom, which means the wiser you become, which means you listen to more wisdom. And hold on. Discipline in wisdom begets a wise heart, which should beget more discipline and wisdom. Things build on one another. It is possible to grow and advance beyond where we are. And that's what we can take away from Proverbs 4, 10 through 27. Please bow your heads in prayer with me, and I'll close. Dear Father in heaven, thank you for this passage. Thank you for the call to wisdom. And thank you for simple passages that, even if they are not the most profound things that we have ever heard, that oftentimes we need to learn and relearn and rehear the simple lessons, because the basics are upon what everything is built. And so please help us to live in wisdom, but also to recognize when we are living wisely and to not be so hard and be so ungracious to ourselves that we do not evaluate ourselves in light of how you see us. Thank you for this. In your Son's name I pray. Amen.